15, 18, something like that. Okay. Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear okay. Is that right? Oh, you got to accept it. Yeah. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is a hybrid event. We're recording it for the YouTube website. We have a few people here in the classroom there at HNC. We also got a number of people online, and I think more trickling in. So welcome whether you're in Nanjing or elsewhere in the virtual HNC community or one of the other two site campuses. This is, I think, a special event for several reasons. First, for its own sake, because an experiential learning trip to Southeast Asia, specifically to Singapore and Ho Chi Minh City, is an inherently worthwhile undertaking, but also because of the broader context that I'll say a bit about. This was the second trip the end of November in our new HNC in the World Experiential Learning Initiative. That started last April when I joined 7 of our students, a smaller group, on our inaugural trip to Peru to look at China-Latin America relations. And then this last time at the end of November, we moved on to another part of the world with some somewhat different issues. We had a much larger group, I think 19 students and some different components. One of the common features of both trips is that they were generously supported by the Teaching and Learning Fund, which has been a gift by the Hopkins-Nanjing Council member, Julie Ranganen. So we want to thank her for her strong and long-lasting engagement with the Hopkins-Nanjing Center. The intellectual agenda behind HNC in the world is the fact that there's a growing interest, which we've noticed among our students and faculty, and more broadly over the last few years, the growing interest in China's global engagements. It's a very different China and a very different world now than when we opened in 1986. And to understand both China and the world fully, we have to understand the political, economic, and societal engagements between Chinese entities and local realities on the ground in far-flung places, particularly in the global south. A third reason why this event is noteworthy is the fact that we're doing this panel here today, both virtually and the HNC campus in Nanjing in hybrid mode. With China finally reopening normal travel just in recent weeks, we're at last headed back towards normality for the first time in over 3 years. I heard a few days ago we have around 96 students on campus during this transitional hybrid spring semester, and I'm joined here in person by 2 of our students on the panel, as well as others in the audience who went on the trip, alongside our virtual attendees, and those will be watching the recording later in the broader HNC and SciENce communities. And we are finally back on the trajectory towards being fully in person here on campus next September, and I think we're all very thankful that we've managed to come through what's undoubtedly the most challenging period in HNC's history. We were affected earlier and longer by the pandemic than the vast majority of institutions. So without saying more about the background, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. First, we have Professor David Arase, who happens to be in Hanoi at the moment, and we led the academic mini-course component of the trip. After that, we have Matt Sperzel, who, as a student worker, engages with global careers and organized much of the career trek component of the trip with visits to companies and other institutions. After that, we'll turn to 3 of our other student participants, Yang Longtan, who's in Dubai, and Claire Delay and Joe Baldock, who are here at HNC with me today. We'll all discuss different aspects of the trip, and then we'll open up to other comments and Q&A. So I'll start off with Professor David Arase.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Adam. So Adam first sort of broached the topic of doing this, a kind of a experiential learning trip to Southeast Asia at the beginning of the semester. And so we sort of brainstormed about it and had to rearrange schedules and things. And honestly, we could have used a little more time for preparation, but in the end, I think it came out okay. So the idea was to first go to Singapore, and of course, Singapore is sort of the intellectual. Well, I think the Singaporeans like to think of themselves as the brains of Southeast Asia, and so I mean that is actually a natural place to go if you want to look at Sino-US relations from third country points of view. Particularly if we're looking at how outside of the tunnel vision of bilateral relations, at how the Sino-US relationship is working out with third parties, particularly today, as we're in a new era of strategic competition, and both sides are looking for friends and allies and partners, not necessarily another Cold War, not another bloc confrontation, but certainly networks of friends and reliable partners. And so, Southeast Asia is, in this respect, a real battleground. So Singapore is a logical place to go. Lots of think tanks. So I have some contacts there. We visited the Institute Southeast Asian Studies, East Asia Institute. If we had more than 2.5 days, we could have done more. But and then also Bilahari Kausikan, former permanent secretary, he agreed to speak with the help arrangement of an alum, I believe, and and the key here, the key point of this experience was to have HNC students. We had even a Chinese student from the mainland accompany us. Listen to Southeast Asian researchers talk about the bilateral competition and how they thought about it. So I think that's very valuable. I don't think any of the HNC students needs another Chinese head or an American head telling them, what the state of Sino-US competition is. They really need to hear it from real people who are in the third countries that actually have agency and who in fact do have a vote in how things will turn out in the world. So I assume you all have a copy of the trip itinerary and the course syllabus, but just to cover the basics here. So the reading list covers some general background issues of ASEAN. ASEAN, its struggles to remain relevant as a regional, Southeast Asian regional governance institution. And then, of course, its engagement with the two powers. And then some more of the readings focusing on ASEAN-China relations, others focusing on the ASEAN-US relations. And then also, and in the third category, local perceptions of this Sino-US rivalry. And all of these, I think all of these perspectives add something to what your typical international student or Chinese student coming to HNC knows and thinks about the relationship. And then we also looked at the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative by the US and its allies, the Quad. Looked at the South China Sea issue. And then because we were going to Vietnam, we looked in particular at how Vietnam views, Vietnam's perspective. It's a key swing player in the region. But in addition, because we're in Vietnam, to take the opportunity to familiarize ourselves with the Mekong River. I mean, as a geographical, geoeconomic, geopolitical reality, because it shapes so much of Indochina, the Indochina experience. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the kind of eco tour I wanted to have. With more preparation, we could have done that, but we did. The students, in fact, we did arrange for the students to have a tour of the delta to get a physical impression of it, because you can't really understand the importance of the Mekong River and its vastness. It's also, you know, in a way, its grandeur, without actually seeing it, without actually being on it. So yeah, then in Vietnam, you know, luckily the Fulbright University of Vietnam, and Vu Minh Huang was the lead on that, who I'm going to be seeing tomorrow, in fact, here in Hanoi. So he set up a program, and then the next day on Friday, we had a session with Professor Sang, who is down there, but he spent time in Taiwan. He actually, I think, had a he has a military background, and he's got a very good conception of how this geopolitical rivalry between the U.S. and China is working out, and how Vietnam is negotiating it. And I'm not so his presentation, I thought, was really good, and I hope the students were listening to it. But at the same time, you know, the students were looking for jobs. So even though we had, you know, maybe 2 days and 2.5 days in Singapore, and maybe 2 days in Ho Chi Minh City. So half of that time was spent for the students looking for jobs. The other half, of course, was doing academic things. But I think, honestly, it was a value-packed program, I mean, my own view, and I really enjoyed doing it. It involved some trials at certain times, but you know, in retrospect, it's one of these things that, you know, you look back on and you're glad you did it, you know. So okay, that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Professor Arase. So going from Professor Arase in Hanoi to Matt Sperzel in Taipei, who will talk a bit about the career trek component that he organized.
Yes, hi everyone. I hope you can all hear me well enough. I'm Matt Sperzel. As Professor Webb just mentioned, I was responsible for organizing the career trek portion of the trip. I'm a first-year MAIR student and certificate at HNC. Yeah, so this was really my only year to get involved in the HNC extracurricular activities, which is why I signed up for the career services. And unfortunately, our former head of career services departed from the role just as it was becoming possible to travel again. So I kind of assumed that role in his absence. And as we decided with Professors Webb and Arase that this was going to happen, yeah, we decided, I think that was really valuable, was that we did get to share resources between the career trek and the experiential learning. So, you know, as the person who's directing the career portion of the trip, I was glad to we got quite a high head count, you know, in terms of people who are participating. So that was good for me. From the beginning, I think I knew the most important of the resources that I could leverage was our SICE and HNC alumni network. So I started digging, you know, up old contacts and scouring LinkedIn for, you know, people who were working in Singapore and Ho Chi Minh who had gone to SICE or HNC. And fortunately, the handful of people that I reached out to were really responsive and pretty much all too happy to accommodate us. So that worked out really great. We spoke with alumni, let's see, first in Singapore from HSBC and Moody's, which are obviously really big employers, and we really valued our time with them. And then outside of the alumni network, I thought it would be nice to leverage some other companies outside of financial services sphere in particular, because Singapore just has so much to offer. So luckily, I had some contacts at the US Embassy there who were also all too happy to host us. And that worked well. It doubled as a career trek, but we were also able to pick their brains about our course themes, which was great. And then I ended up cold calling a couple of organizations as well. Yeah, we ended up meeting with the World Bank, who was very receptive and welcoming. And yeah, I think students got a lot out of that one. And then as we went to Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh City was a bit more challenging in terms of finding the alumni, but we managed, and they pulled through for us. Actually, we met an HNC alum working at KPMG, who had a lot to say about the growing business opportunities in Southeast Asia and the Mekong region in particular. And then we also got to speak with an alum who held an executive position at a Vietnamese digital services and mobile gaming company, which I think the company was called VNG for anybody interesting. This is a really fast growing company with a beautiful campus, very typical of those like up and coming tech companies, which was really fun. And this meeting was really nice in particular because we got a taste of a different industry that most of the participants weren't necessarily seeking out or expecting, but I think it ended up really piquing our interests. So yeah, in the end, everything went extremely smoothly for one of our first international trips. I guess this was the second HNC in the world, right? And we were really lucky to have access to Professor Arase's extensive contacts throughout the region in Singapore and Vietnam. And the career portion just meshed very well with the educational themes. So a lot of synergy going on. I think a lot of people got, a lot out of it. And, obviously I'm quite keen to do it again. So, but we'll see. Yeah, so I'm happy to take anybody's questions at the end about that. But I guess now we can hear from some of our panelists and people who participated on it. I don't know who's next.
Yeah,
Okay,
I can
thank
go
you.
first.
We're going to Yang Long Tan in Dubai.
Yep. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I am Yang Long and I'm in Dubai right now. Although I really wish that I was there in the classroom with you guys in Nanjing. I'm actually applying for a tourist visa now that China opened up. So maybe I'll see some of you for graduation, hopefully. And I'm going to talk about the entire trip on a more broad level. And I think Joe and Claire will zoom into Singapore and Vietnam more specifically. So I'll cover three key things in my sharing. I think the first thing is why this trip meant a lot to some of us. Number two, what made this trip special to us? And the third thing is some of our takeaways from this entire trip. So the first thing, why did this trip mean a lot to all of us? I think some of the earlier speakers shared the fact that the HNC community is very scattered. I think that was a big part of why this trip was so, it meant a lot to us because it brought people from different parts of the world together in a trip that was very compressed over the space of 9 days. And so you could really talk to everyone, do things together and learn from each other. And, I met my first Chinese friend from the program on this trip, and that was very special as well. And even meeting people at that point in time, I was based in Taipei, but even meeting people who came all the way from the US, from Vietnam, so on and so forth, that I think really elevated the experience because, previously you would only know them on your Zoom classes. I think the other part of it also is that the entire trip really complemented HNC's curriculum and offerings in the sense that I think a lot of HNC classes obviously focuses on China and Chinese society. You do have a couple of classes that maybe look outside of China and see its dealings with the rest of the world. But even if you think about Southeast Asia, it tends to be maybe one of the classes, or maybe you just look at the region as a whole. And I think what this trip really does is for you to focus squarely on China's engagement with a region that is bordering it. And that experience, that academic and immersive experience of being able to do so, you probably cannot get it at the HNC center itself. And I think this trip really brings to life a lot of what you learn at the HNC as well. And obviously, this is another important aspect is the networking experience that we all had, where we got to meet, Professor Webb and Professor Arase as well. I mean, I took a class under Professor Arase and it was a great class, but at the end of the day, it's still on Zoom. And just being able to, talk to Professor Arase in person, hear some of his stories that might not even come up in the classroom, I think that was also very special. And alumni as well, I think, where you would meet people who worked in Singapore and Vietnam for many years and hear what it is like to work in Southeast Asia, what it is like to leverage your HNC degree and education. That is something that you would not get in any other setting. And now to the second part of my sharing, what then made this trip really special for all of us? I think the first thing is what I alluded to, the fact that this was an immersion and not just classroom learning, where I think, even as someone from Southeast Asia, I would go in this trip and go to Singapore or Vietnam, and just being able to be with all of you guys, or my classmates and professors, and hearing questions that came up, topics that came up, the way that they were being discussed, I think I got a lot of new perspectives towards my own region. I mean, from very basic things like coming into Singapore, and I think straight away a couple of cohort mates started asking me, oh, why are there 4 languages on almost everything you see in Singapore, to more difficult issues like, what is LGBT rights like in Singapore, or why is there the death penalty in Singapore? And I was always very glad to share my own perspectives. But I think that really allowed me to gain a new insight into my own region. And I think just being also literally, for example, walking the streets of Singapore and Vietnam, and seeing things for yourself, I think brings to life a lot of maybe previously more theoretical concepts about international relations, about Southeast Asia, and other things, like, for example, trying to cross the road in Vietnam. That's almost a skill set in itself that you would not realize, that what it means to be in a country that is developing rapidly, that is going to be a very important economic actor in Southeast Asia. Those are big words, but being there in Vietnam, you feel the energy, you talk to the people. I think that's something that you cannot replace in an immersion compared to classroom learning. And I think the other aspect about why it's so special is really the fact that it is Singapore and Vietnam that we chose. I think both countries are quite important to the region when you consider, the perspective of international relations. I think a lot of the topics that you learn with Chinese foreign policy, or with the broader Asian region, a lot of the key security issues today, if you think about it, the South China Sea dispute, you could also think about the Burmese Myanmar crisis right now, so many others in the region. I think a lot of it involves Singapore and Vietnam playing important roles as regional actors. And even, for example, I think Professor Arase alluded to it just now, ASEAN centrality in the region. I think both countries think about the issue very differently, and just coming into this setting and speaking to alumni as well as professionals who have worked in this field and industry for a very long time, hearing their perspectives, I think that is really irreplaceable. I can give you an example. So let's talk about ASEAN centrality, right? There were so many anecdotes used to describe ASEAN. I think there was the talk of ASEAN being like a donut with a hole in the middle. I can't remember how many variations of the donut there were, and also I think someone compared ASEAN to a cow or something like that, plowing the field, and so that the horse can run at last. A lot of these anecdotes which tells you obviously how difficult it is to really understand ASEAN, but also the different takes on an organization that is so important for the region. And I think that is very valuable. And the last thing about why this trip was so special is the fact that it's so broad in what it has to offer. There were so many components about it. And I think Matt talked about this just now, with 20 over people, everyone has a different goal coming to this trip. Some of us want to find jobs, others just want to travel, and others want to learn more about China or maybe Southeast Asia. And if you had a kind of linear program with a limited set of offering, then I don't think people would leave feeling satisfied. But I think what you had in this program, you literally had so many things. You could play, you could learn, you could also dialogue, you could network, and all of these really came together to make everyone, I think, satisfied to a reasonable extent. And I mean, I talked to quite a number of the participants after the trip, and I think many people felt, yes, we were quite tired by the end, but man, that was a very memorable trip with a lot of takeaways for everyone. And so my last part of my sharing, some of the key takeaways for all of us, I think first and foremost, how diverse Southeast Asia is. I mean, I'm from Southeast Asia, but really I'm just from one country, and just even going to Vietnam and discussing about the region, I think makes me realize also that we all should avoid, talking about the region as a singular entity. Every country has its own almost unique history and culture, and I think that's something that, even when having group discussions with the entire group going on the trip, I think we realize that, it's always easy to forget that fact when you just talk about, the US and China and Japan, trying to interact in this region. And I think now you have a very real life reminder that there is more to this entire picture, which leads me to my next point, that a lot of us came into this trip very interested in US-China great power competition. But then I think we leave realizing that it's not the only game in town. There is so much more. Southeast Asian countries are trying to increase their own agency in the region. And for example, just learning about how Vietnam has a lot of economic priorities, trying to develop their gaming industry, for example, and even Singapore trying to maintain its independence by maybe diversifying its food supplies, even when supply chains are being threatened. And you see that these countries do not see the world really through the prism of great power competition, but through their own interests. And I think that was a very intellectually enlightening moment for many of us, not to always use the framework of great power competition to understand other regions. And last but not least, I think I want to end off on this note. I think the biggest takeaway for me must be the relationships I found and forged with my cohort mates, with my professors, and even some of the alumni. I think that's so valuable because previously, I think the HNC experience has really been a bit more detached for me, and attending HNC classes are great. Learning from the professors has been enlightening, but it's still on the screen. I think a lot of us signed up for this program, some of us before COVID, some of us during COVID, hoping for that HNC experience where we could form those deeper bonds and have those conversations about IR and China and other topics. And I think that there has been a limit on that because of just the entire modality that we've been in. But this trip, I think, has been a very bold decision to go ahead with it, to have it and let everyone mingle for 9 or 10 days. And I'm really appreciative for that. I think that to me has been almost the peak of my HNC experience so far. I really enjoyed it. And I think I would end on that note and pass the time to Joe. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Yang Long. So coming back to campus here in Nanjing, Joe Baldock.
Yeah, so I'm going to discuss a couple of the things that we did and sort of learned about in Singapore. Just as a rundown again of the things that the people that we met with in Singapore, at National University of Singapore, we met with Pang Ar from the East Asia Institute. We also met with the former permanent representative of Singapore to the UN, Bilahari Kausikan. And then we also met with, we had an opportunity to go to ICES and meet with 2 scholars there, Huang Tiha and William Chung. And each of them had amazing insights that were all sort of different from each other. So first off, with our first speaker, Pang Ar, he had a really great, as Yang had mentioned, he had a really great analog, or a really great analogy for ASEAN being a donut, and sort of like the concept of ASEAN centrality of there's not one singular country that's sort of in the middle, but it's kind of like a donut of like an alliance of various countries, and that was a really great opening just to sort of introduce a couple of sort of there's just a couple of basic concepts in terms of learning more about ASEAN. That set us up really well for the rest of the trip. The next speaker that we had after that was Bilahari Kausikan, and a lot of people really ended up loving the points that Bilahari made because he was incredibly direct and very blunt about a lot of his views on international relations. And also, as Yang had just mentioned, he referred to ASEAN as people criticizing ASEAN for being people criticizing a cow for not being a good horse, because it's not supposed to be sort of like the EU in terms of a pooled sovereignty organization. It's more like, like a donut, where it's just sort of a couple of different groups or a couple of different countries coming together to help solve interregional security issues and sort of maintaining peace relationships. So that was a really interesting perspective as well. Something that a view that he also had was that a lot of conflict that's coming about now in international relations tended to sort of be the norm, especially before the Cold War. And he views that this is now a return to a normalcy in international relations, as opposed to an increase in sort of a conflict type state, which was also really interesting. Which is really interesting and something that we hadn't really come into contact with before. And then the other thing that he also had mentioned was ASEAN as an organization. It has sort of a way of going about things that is not putting all of its eggs in one basket and sort of having to a lot of ASEAN countries having to manage multiple relationships at one time due to it being a region of countries that obviously tend to be that are a little bit smaller in terms of physical size. So a lot of these countries need to sort of balance great power relationships with a lot of multiple different countries, and having to basically not put all of your eggs in one basket. He did, however, go into a couple of different details about different conflicts within the region, and he mentioned the relevance of Myanmar and sort of how how some people tend to view the Myanmar issue as like a larger issue within ASEAN, and he views it to not be as serious as some people may make it out to be, or so as detrimental, I would say, as some people may make it out to be. But he also did have some concerns about East Timor joining ASEAN in the future as well. So those were all really interesting points that he was able to make. And a lot of us found that he gave sort of a very realist view on how, sort of the situation within the region. But it was also really interesting because some of the points that he made, especially about ASEAN not necessarily being, especially about international relations being sort of centered outside of the US-China relationship, especially because I think it was like a month or two after that, ASEAN and EU, which was something that he had also stressed, is ASEAN relationships with the EU as well. He had stressed that also being sort of a big thing. And then the ASEAN and the EU had a summit, I think it was like a month after we had come back. So it was really interesting to be able to sort of learn about that, and then immediately come out of that and then see a large meeting where ASEAN and the EU were discussing having other options outside of just the US and China. So that was also really insightful. And then our last sort of academic speaker in our last two academic speakers in the academic track of the academic side of the house were from ICES, and that was Huang Ti-ha and William Chung. And both of them were very excellent in a lot of the things. We especially found Huang Ti-ha to be incredibly insightful. She raised a lot of really great points about global supply chains and supply chain shifts, which of course we also learned about a lot in Vietnam as well, and how a lot of companies now are looking to have this idea of China plus one came around a lot of companies wanting to have a moving from just in time to just in case. So always having sort of a backup to a singular supply chain. And a lot of companies were sort of adding in redundant supply chains or moving supply chains altogether from China to Vietnam. And that was just something that was in response to the pandemic happening, and a lot of the controls that they saw as being potentially dangerous for the stability of future supply chains. So that was something a concept that she had introduced that sort of ended up coming up multiple times throughout the trip, which was really interesting. And then she also had emphasized that China is the most, in terms of large powers, China is the most powerful in the region. However, ASEAN being sort of the organization that it is, doesn't, necessarily isn't as willing to put all of its eggs in one basket. So, of course, being able to diversify across a couple of different powers as well. And going to China, and speaking of China and the US, going to China and the US for different needs. So things such as 5G or infrastructure type of things from China, and US in like security related issues with the US. She also did, however, emphasize that when we mentioned great power rivalry within Southeast Asia, that's not just limited to China and the US. So she also did a really great job of decentering it away from solely that relationship. And also talked about a lot of the things that Japan, Russia, Australia, and India are also doing in the region as well. Of course, Japan is doing a lot of infrastructure things. Russia is also doing Russia is also supplying a certain amount of security. And then Australia sort of changing its image within Southeast Asia as sort of a Western power, and also sort of trying to include itself more in the Indo-Pacific framework and in the Indo-Pacific, so the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. And then India also being an important player, especially in the future for Southeast Asia, since ASEAN always sort of reserves a spot for them specifically. So it was really great to be able to, and of course she also spoke a lot about the future of Vietnam, which was also a really great transition from it being our sort of last speaker in Singapore to then heading over to Vietnam. So a lot of it was really excellent and raised a lot of really great points that I think that were it was essential for us to be there to actually be able to, physically walk out into Singapore and sort of seizing those things in motion, especially Singapore being sort of Singapore being much more of a diverse country than sometimes a lot of the narratives that get played. That was also really interesting to sort of see firsthand. And then, sort of Yang Long and Matt had mentioned, I think the career aspects of the trip also melded really well into the academic aspects. I mean, for example, we went to the World Bank, the US Embassy, and HSBC in Singapore, and we were able to answer a lot. We were able to ask a lot of economic questions about the future of Southeast Asia and sort of a couple of economic things that we were sort of hearing about for the World Bank and the HSBC, and then also asking about sort of the way that the US relationship with Singapore is being handled at the US Embassy as well, and sort of hearing the US perspective on everything that's going on in Southeast Asia. So it was really great also to be able to just, like I said, like Yang Long had mentioned, be able to meet, other people from other different areas of the world who are also in HNC, and also our classmate Chen Yingzhi was one of the Chinese students that was able to go, which was really awesome. So she joined us for the Singapore portion. But yeah, so it was a really great experience, and I feel like I lived probably 3 lives in the 2.5 days that we were in Singapore, because we had so many things planned. But yeah, even though it was really packed, we got exposed to a lot of really great information really quickly, especially sort of reframing the narrative of great power rivalry and how that interacts with ASEAN, and how ASEAN interacts with great powers. So
Given Yalon's comment earlier, I don't know whether living 3 lives in Singapore will transition to seeing one's life flash the one crossing the road in Vietnam. But anyway, Claire Delay.
So yeah, I'll kind of finish by talking about our time in Vietnam, and also echoing a little bit of what the panelists have already said. I'll start by saying this was a really important trip for me. I've been taking classes last semester in Chicago, and I felt kind of more separate from the larger HNC community. So getting to go on this trip was also definitely a highlight, especially for the last semester for me, actually meeting all the students in person. But going to Vietnam off of Singapore, I think was a really interesting transition to make, because obviously Singapore is a little bit more developed in their economy and the businesses that we were seeing, and the academic structures that were there and the researchers that we were meeting. So it's interesting going from that to Ho Chi Minh, which I really appreciated that transition because I think it highlighted the differences that exist within Southeast Asia. Because when we were talking in Singapore about Southeast Asian centrality, if you're just taking that from one perspective of Singapore, it doesn't really paint the picture. So going to another country, I think helped kind of round out that image. So it was really cool that we got to go to 2 different countries in this trip too. So that's something that I definitely want to highlight. But something I think about a lot, and I thought about a lot on this trip, was I think oftentimes both the United States and China suffer from the same ailment of forgetting that the rest of the world exists. Because we exist in our own power structure, right? Both countries existed with great power. And going to Vietnam, I think, was a good reminder, and I think something that everyone in the HNC community understands is that location matters for when you're studying things and who you're hearing it from, who's telling you this information. And I think Vietnam was a really strong example of that, of hearing from PhD students as well as like qualified researchers and their perspectives and the interests in Vietnam, right, from a Vietnamese perspective. To me, I think that was obviously the most important part of the trip. We started by speaking with some PhD students who were running some research that had to do with the way domestic politics was being perceived in Vietnam, which I won't go into all the details of that. We sort of got into it a little bit with the relevancy of their research too, because they're PhD students, so they're still like obviously working out a lot of kinks. But it was a great experience to have because we were speaking about the different political structures within Vietnam and the perspectives and the way the government is structured. And that's just not a conversation you're going to have with your Chinese professor who's teaching you about Chinese-Vietnamese relationships, right? When you're in Vietnam, it's not a question of if Vietnamese agency exists. It's, of course, we have an agency and this is how we're using it. So even though I don't have a background in Vietnam, it was really interesting to kind of get a taste of those different concepts and those different ideas from a Vietnamese perspective. We also did talk with another researcher while we were there who talked a little bit more specifically about Vietnamese foreign policy. One phrase that really stuck out to me that we heard actually from a few different researchers in Vietnam was bamboo diplomacy. And the way they kind of described this, it's used in a couple of different Southeast Asian countries and it's interpreted differently depending on where you are. But the Vietnamese interpretation is both that bamboo is flexible, right? It can move, but it's also very strong, especially when banded together. And I thought that was a really nice analogy to make, both when you're thinking about ASEAN and like Southeast Asian centrality, but also talking about the strength that Vietnam sees like within their own country, right? Vietnam is no stranger to managing the balance of great powers, right? They're intimately aware of how to deal with that. And that I think has created some really strong policies that they have. One that was mentioned again several times was they have like the 4 no's that goes into their foreign policy. So it's no to joining military alliances, no to like taking sides between great powers, no to military bases being built on Vietnamese soil, and then no to using threats of force to like intimidate people or to intimidate nations into making decisions for international policy. So it was really clear on this trip when speaking with all these different Vietnamese scholars that there was just very strong and independent policies that Vietnam was cultivating for itself. And I think that's something that can be lost sometimes when you're talking, I think Arase mentioned this as well as Yamong, when you're talking about it from a lens of US-China competition. It was nice to get out of that lens and think about it like, how is Vietnam managing these relationships that it has with these powers? So I thought it was both a powerful trip and an interesting trip, and of course I had a lot of fun with my classmates. And I would also be remiss if I didn't also point out that I think one of the highlights was having Yamong on the trip and also our other classmate Didi. Didi was from Vietnam. Having both of them there, I think transformed the trip because they were really able to be sort of like, I don't want to say like you're a cultural touchstone, but like anytime we had a question like, what's up with this? Or like, I didn't understand this. We could really go to them and they were so like welcoming and knowledgeable of just like explaining their perspective, which was amazing. And I also think speaks to like the caliber of student that HNC has, right? Having these classmates that can be in class with you or go with you on a trip makes that experience so much better. So, yeah, I mean, I loved it. I would do it again. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. A lot of observations and insights. So I guess we can open up for other comments or Q&A, both from people who are in attendance virtually as well as those in the room here. I noticed apart from our panelists, several people here in this room actually went on the trip as well. So if anyone wants to add any observations, you're certainly welcome to do so, or if anyone either here or online has a question or comment to add. Alex, I'm going to try and point the camera at you. I don't know whether it'll work.
I see Michael and Nathan and
Okay, Alex, yes.
So,
Alex, yeah, they're sitting together.
but one of the interesting things that I have still from my trips is like, for me, I'm like a very observation person. I like to see things or in the background, things that people look at. And I feel like I got both of that, like in Singapore and Vietnam. So like, I remember in Singapore, we're actually meeting with the World Bank. I told Rossi about this too. I'm looking in the back behind where they're having this talk. I'm seeing jets fly in the background. And after doing some research, and after Rossi mentioned it, Rossi mentioned like what type of jets were they? I can probably say with like probably 85% certainty, those are F-35s, just based on how they look. So it was like interesting seeing, you know, like one of America's, I guess, most expensive aircrafts being flown by the Singapore military. So you kind of see, I guess, this aspect of like, you know, this great power rivalry still existing, and still very present in the region. And then you kind of flip it on its side, you know, you go to Vietnam. And because after one day, I think I just walked out of the whole Korea trek. I'm like, I'm not interested in this, so I decided to go on my own. And this was like the more, I guess, how would you say, I don't want to say the negative, but like definitely the more real aspect of like how the scars that you get and have to take in order to achieve their, you know, their agency. You know, I'm walking down the road and, you know, I see the person who with a large TED being after doing some research and going to a war about Nanjing War. It was very clear that that person was suffering from, I guess, a person who was born after, you know, the effects of Agent Orange, and so that effects still linger on, even though the war has already passed. And then going to the War Memorials Museum as well was like, it was interesting to see, you know, how they kind of balance, you know, the fact that they fought a very brutal war for pretty close to 2-3 decades between multiple powers. And I see also China as well, and so seeing how they kind of deal with that, but also kind of dealing with the relations with the US and China as well. And you just kind of like to see, you know, all this unpacking how strong and how like independent these countries are. And kind of like also kind of flip on this like away from the whole US-China rivalry is like also seeing like how close knit this community, you know, this Southeast Asian community is. When we ended up going to the ASEAN Food Festival, different foods from like different regions, and like it's like a very big thing, the Lebanon area that we're at. And this is kind of interesting to have that, you know, that shared, like an area where they can share their cultures amongst each other. And like I felt the same thing in Singapore too, like all of their culture sharing amongst, you know, people who are their neighbors as well as like the people in the region as well. So it was interesting to see these observations.
Yeah, a lot of stories there. Yeah. And any other thoughts? Or if we have questions from anyone who's online as well. I see there's a link from a blog post which Betty just put in the chat as well. I think this was just put up a few days ago. And you can see that in the chat. Any other questions or thoughts? And there's also the posting about the Peru trip a bit further down in the chat. Yeah, you have a question?
When response to all this is sharing is a fantastic sharing of this experiences. We have a similar study learning from this semester.
I don't think there's anything planned for spring break at this point. I mean, this is obviously a long-term thing we want to do more of. I mean, there are conversations about trips, within China or other places where we have clusters of students. So there's conversations going on, but so, I mean, there certainly is something that we do want to build up longer term for HNC. I mean, we should be doing at least 1 or 2 trips every semester in the ideal world where we have the funding and the sustained support for it. Any other questions? Yeah, Max Wapple. Max is our new career services manager who joined back in middle of February. And he's also a graduate of HNC and SAIS DC. Max.
Yeah. So hello everyone. Nice to meet you virtually. If you want to nag somebody about a spring trip, you should probably shoot an email to HNC Career Services then, and you can nag me about it. So here I had a question about like a general kind of consensus that I'm hearing from everyone who participated, which seemed to be like the experiential learning component and the career services component together was what made this awesome. And I just want to kind of put a finer point on that. Would you all agree that like it's essentially that's the way to do this, is that students want to have both components, and that it would be a real loss to just do a career trip or just do an experiential learning trip? And then a kind of follow-up question to that would be, how important do you think it is that those two components are thematically matched? Or is that not important at all? Does anybody have a take on that?
But I should probably add a comment on that, because having been on both trips, I mean, we've got, I think, one student here who was in the Peru trip last year. I mean, the Peru trip did not have a career trek component. This was a smaller undertaking. I think this was partly a reflection of, what the economic sort of range is in each destination. I mean, obviously there are SAIS alumni in Lima, but it's not, a place where you get a large clustering of people, seeking employment. And so I think it depends a bit on the destination. But who wants to take this, Alex?
And Nathan can go after. It was like actually one of like the things I was kind of focusing on was like obviously these like career track opportunities, but also kind of what we really want to press, each and every one of like our career areas and like what is going on in the region. I think the one that kind of like stuck out the most, me personally, was at GMG Games, where they initially, I think after our conversation, they initially got their commercial funding from in support from Tencent. And they also followed a similar development cycle as Tencent, but now have become like a tech giant amongst themselves within Vietnam, I would say in the region as well. It's growing pretty fast. And I think having that backup between like Arase's, I guess the academic side of it really complemented well for asking these questions, what's going on. For the people on the ground right now, like who are basically doing the day-to-day operations on the back end of what's going on internationally. So I feel like it meshed almost perfectly. You can get a more perfect meshing.
I can add a little bit to that, Max. Drawing on Professor Arase's point earlier about that this was a trip was a value pack. I thought that was a really good point, because it really was invaluable for both sections of the trip to draw on each other's resources, in terms of the people that we spoke to, and also in terms of the bit of funding that we had available to us. So I think we also got lucky in the sense that thematically the themes did match well. For instance, we spoke to the US Embassy in Singapore, and there we got to talk about, they were kind of introducing us to the career of diplomacy, telling us about the idiosyncrasies of what it's like being a foreign service officer in such a unique place like Singapore or Southeast Asia in general. And then we also got to talk about those issues that we were discussing every day on the trip as part of the experiential learning portion. So I think that worked out really well. I don't think necessarily that the future career treks need to have some kind of theme to them, or educational theme, but I think it was location that really helped us out there. Going to Singapore and Vietnam, we had access to just a wide breadth of different organizations, companies, and speakers, and there was a lot of synergy. Yeah.
Nathan?
Actually, Alex kind of took my points already and said it before. I think there was a lot of excellent dovetailing with the career track portions and the academic portions. And especially nice as we get to hear from an academic perspective about what's going on. We can have more direct kind of even career related questions to the academics, and also more broader academic questions to more people who met for a career track. And I think a good example of this, we went to the World Bank as well, where we were able to where the World Bank was talking more about careers at the World Bank. We can also talk about, okay, what are your operations, and like when you see the World Bank kind of working in the broader ASEAN kind of network. So I just want to echo a lot of what everyone else has already said.
Yeah, actually, I have a point to make here on this. That is, yeah, I think what Matt said is location is really important, and so I think some key places where you could go that where job opportunities and also academic interest both sort of coincide would be places like Tokyo or Seoul or Delhi or Taipei. Those in all those places, the economic opportunities and particularly for American corporations, and also for local corporations that want to get into U.S. supply chains, U.S.-led supply chains. That's going to be really important. And then at the same time, you're going to have all these geoeconomic and geopolitical issues, this whole swirl of events and swirl of forces, bringing the economic and geopolitical trends together. There are certain nodes where that happens, right? So that's going to be places like Seoul, Tokyo, Taipei, Delhi, and other places, Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, so those are all places to think about. I mean, just that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think I'd add, part of the, as I said at the beginning, part of the intellectual justification for having this kind of HNC and world coverage, including, particularly of the global South, is if you look at the centers of gravity in the world, both economically and demographically, it is ultimately, I think, moving away from both the US and China in the long run in terms of the portion of world population and world economic weight that both have. I don't think it's lost on anyone that India's population is surpassing China's this year. Africa is the fastest growing both demographically and probably economically over the next generation as well. So thinking about how America, China, all of these different transnational forces in the world are interacting, it is something that we need to pay more attention to. And it's also, from a career track standpoint, it probably is where a larger number of our graduates are going, if you're looking sort of 10, 20, 30 years out. I think there was a hand up over here. Yeah, Noah?
Yeah, I had something to respond to Max's question more directly. I did not go on this trip, but I did go on a trip to Shanghai and Hong Kong in 2019 that was only career oriented. And I think that what it sounds like made the trip so special was the combination of it's a place that people from the HNC or from SAIS more broadly maybe don't have as much experience with, right? Added to the fact that if you're looking for work somewhere, it would be nice to understand where you're going a little bit better, as well as know what life in that place is like, right? If you get a job offer in Vietnam and you've been there for one day for the interview and that's it, do you take that? Who knows? So I think, maybe that type of dual education experience might not be that important for Shanghai, because Shanghai is an hour away from us and we can go there and get more information about it and understand how it is. And it's less foreign to us at the HNC. But I mean, even somewhere like Hong Kong is like historically, at least recently, different, and has different political factors and stuff going on that are worth studying and thinking about, and has different aspects to its life than something like being in like Nanjing or another large mainland Chinese city. So I think that it doesn't have to be the way for all career treks to go. But if there are career treks that are looking to, if there are treks that are looking to expand outward from like from mainland China, I think it's for sure very worthwhile for the student experience. And also is a way for people to feel more engaged, because I, a lot of times on the career trek that I went on, felt very checked out when we went to like a bunch of banks, and I am not very interested in econ stuff, but there's a lot of banks in Hong Kong. So we visited a lot of those, and maybe I could have benefited from like going to a museum and learning a little bit more about Hong Kong's history. So that would be my perspective on it. It doesn't have to be, but it sounds like when it does and when it works really, really well. And there's probably room for both and interest in both.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important how much during the pandemic, both in HNC and, more broadly across sites, we have, I think, started rethinking a lot of how the different components of the academic program fit together, how people's career plans and the kind of experience and expertise they want to gain, how a lot of things need to be rethought from scratch. So there has been this sort of experiment in dealing with sort of short-term challenges, like people studying online and wanting to find ways to have these common in-person experiences, but it's also, I think, looking forward, raw material for rethinking a lot of components. I don't want to put Nancy on the spot, but she's the only person here who went on the Peru trip. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that. It's almost a year ago now, right?
Yeah, almost. Well, I don't know what to say. I think, I don't know. Man, okay.
Not to put you on the spot.
Well, I think all that, or in listening to everything that everyone said, I think especially hearing about more so the academic components of the trip and how it provided insight to a new area, I think that very much aligned with basically almost all of our experience in Peru, though having a similar experience going to the US Embassy, it was a great experience that we had there. But I want to echo, I think, some of the things and the most valuable sort of like lessons or experiences that people got out of the Singapore and Vietnam trip sounds very similar to our takeaways from Peru, mostly that learning from people in the area is unparalleled and their thoughts. Something in Peru, I would say not the only focus, but a lot of the focus of our trip and our conversations there were about Chinese mining companies in Peru. And so to get that dual perspective of both visiting the mining company, and then also people were talking about, I think in Vietnam especially, sort of the disparity between like developed and undeveloped, or like the success of companies and their campuses per se, their offices, versus just seeing the rest of the country. So having that experience in Peru, but really speaking with, the employees of the mining company, as well as the like political and social activists who were not going against the mining company, but kind of against the mining company. So I think being able to hear those two perspectives, rather than, we did a fair amount of reading in preparation beforehand, and country reports and all these things, but it gives you an idea, but you can't see it. So I think that sort of same takeaway was very, very valuable, and certainly, I suppose, the theme of HNC in the world. I kind of agree with your points on a career element in that, as I don't know how many of us want careers in Lima, Peru.
For mining company.
But so we did get the gentleman's business card at the mining company, so I have it saved somewhere. I don't know, but definitely the exact same thing, even though I was part of a little pocket of HNC students in Washington, DC, and some of us were on the trip together, but I did get the chance to meet classmates who were based in California and That was really, really a great experience and something to bring us together outside of the classroom was invaluable. And yeah, I think that's just about all I have to say, and that we were also very, very tired and definitely jam-packed. But yeah, it's definitely an absolutely great experience.
Yeah, thanks. Any other comments or questions? I think we're almost
Yeah.
where we should be.
I just want to say something about Hong Kong that Noah brought up. And that is, it's true. There are actually are a lot of job openings coming up in Hong Kong because a lot of expats are leaving. And so I think there's going to be lots of opportunities for HNC students in Hong Kong. And I've spent a lot of time in Hong Kong since 2019, up till this past June when I moved to Taiwan. And it's true, I think and there are lots of alums in Hong Kong who are working, who can tell students what it's like to actually live there. But there's also the academic, there's not only jobs, but there's the academic component that would also complement any visit to that city for anyone thinking about, relocating there and thinking about its place in the world going forward. Will it remain with a separate international legal personality or not? And so yeah, I mean, I think that's another place where career services might think about going, but including an academic component, visiting the university campuses, visiting the Foreign Correspondence Club, talking to people who have long experience there of dealing with mainland China and with, but also trying to preserve Hong Kong's special status as a window between, mainland China and the rest of the world. So, and now more than ever, because it's the status of Hong Kong is becoming quite perilous. So, and I would think anybody who's like the age of our students who are thinking about starting a career, this is the kind of stuff that they would want to know. Yeah. Particularly in Hong Kong. Like Noah brought up Hong Kong, and I was thinking, yeah, well, that's actually kind of important.
Okay, any final thoughts or comment? Yeah, Chad in the back.
So I came in really late, so I sort of imagine this was already addressed, but if you want to put it again to briefer form, did it seem to make a pretty good impression on any companies that you would actually want to work for, that you were there in person shaking their hand? Did that seem to put you ahead of the pack in terms of the application process, if you're already going through that or potentially looking to go through that? And secondly, in any or either, was it 2 or 3 countries you went to, any countries, etc., was there just anything at all very broadly that you encountered that you were like, whoa, this element of the work environment or this industry very different from working in the US or China, and I like it?
I think that totally depends on the student as far as like the opportunities for yourself and your career. Like if you were in the room with that person, you got their business card and you followed up with them, sure, that's a contact that you have now. If you didn't do that, no. It's going on the career track is good exposure for you to figure out what you might like to do or not like to do. But as with anything in networking, it depends on what you put into it at the end of the day. I don't know if any of my classmates did that. Some of them could have. We got a lot of business cards, met a lot of people. They were very enthusiastic and hosting us. I can say we were. No one seemed like, oh, have to show these guys. Everyone was pretty pumped to have us there. HNC has a really good reputation. I would say the more important thing was like we went to, like Noah was just saying, he went to a bunch of banks in Hong Kong. I was like, I'm not interested in banks. I felt the same way when I looked at the docket in Singapore, and I was really interested in what I found out I was interested in based off of listening to people and the job description in like finance areas that I didn't realize potentially I would like to go into. So I think for me personally, it was more interesting of like, oh, maybe that is like a realm that I could explore more. But as far as like actually advancing like an application that you have put in, if you sent a follow-up email, probably I didn't even.
So in other words, it did a lot more for you than just an Indeed.com job posting.
For sure, absolutely.
Actually showing you what it was.
I would say meeting with someone in Singapore in their Moody's office was better than meeting with someone. It was definitely a better opportunity.
We did have a happy hour in Singapore with HNC and SAIS alumni. I mean, that actually had a pretty good turnout. I think people stayed quite a while and had quite a lot of conversations individually there too. So there is a large alumni network in the region as more broadly around the world. And that's something that I think these trips do tap into. I mean, the same thing in Peru. I mean, there were alumni whom we met there, including the head of the Peruvian Diplomatic Academy, who was the SAIS alumni. So, I mean, the SAIS alumni network and the HNC alumni network do open a lot of doors for these kinds of experiences. Okay, any final thought or comment from anyone?
If I can be really annoying, I would still love to get a comment on whether there was anything that was like, this is Southeast Asia, and I'm not getting anywhere else other than it being popular.
Sorry, what do you mean?
Just means, was there something either Singapore, Vietnam, that you felt like this is something really special about this region that would help me decide to build at least some portion of my career here that would differentiate it from North America or China?
Well, I think one thing that did come across in the conversations in Vietnam was how up and coming, like the projections on growth for Vietnam going out in the next decade. That in a sense, it's, I mean, people always talk about what is the next China, right? I mean, that's probably an oddly framed question, but I mean, the fact that Vietnam is becoming significantly more important economically, and I mean, also with some sectors moving out of China or becoming less important than China, I think Vietnam is picking up some of that energy and activity. I think that was something we may have noticed. I don't know, anyone else have any particular impressions?
Yeah, there was this HNC alum who worked in Shanghai in the early 2000s or late 90s or something, and now he was in Vietnam, and he was like, he said, I think word for word, Vietnam is China 20 years ago. Granted, he was saying a lot of things with absolute authority that I didn't totally agree with. But I think that it depends what you're looking for. Like, I loved when we were in Singapore, to me, I felt like the work, I mean, it seems like hard work, like you're working long hours in the office, but like a really interesting place to work, like a lot of different people from all over the world. So that was very attractive to me in Singapore. Vietnam felt,
Place?
sorry?
What was that place specific?
KPMG.
KPMG. That was, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. It was the KPMG guy, because he worked for KPMG in Shanghai.
Yeah.
And then switched to Vietnam.
Okay.
But yeah, so I think it sort of depends on what you're looking for. He seemed like the type of guy who liked being on like the forefront of things, it like developed things, whereas like in Singapore felt very much more like you would be a part of a system that is already there. In a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, let me just say that, accountants follow the business. And the value chains are moving out of China into Vietnam, India, Malaysia, Philippines. And of course, with IPEF, initiative by the US and Chip 4, these supply chains will be moving out of China into the surrounding regions. So that's why, that's why this kind of initiative, I think, is very timely for HNC.
I just want to, I wanted to add one final comment. I wanted to stress something that Claire had said earlier, which is the fact that both Yang Long and Didi did a lot of unpaid labor, which we really, really appreciate for them. We really appreciate for them. I know that they answered a lot of our questions that we had about both Singapore and Vietnam, respectively. I think Yang Long got way too many questions about chewing gum and Crazy Rich Asians, which he answered. So
Very patient.
Very patient.
So patient.
Yeah. So we definitely owe a lot to them as well for this trip.
Okay. Alex, do you have a final comment? Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming, whether you're online or here in the room. Thank you to our panelists for all of your insights, and hopefully we'll have more panels, presentations like this in the future as we try and expand this initiative. But I think it definitely served its purpose at the time and also showed the value of this kind of undertaking in the HNC community. So thank you very much for coming, and we'll be posting this on the SAIS YouTube events website. Thank you.